And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight already. Of course, this is a very special live stream report on UFOs revealed and CIA total recall. I'm going to explain exactly what that means tonight. We have Groovy out there in the ideas room running the show. And of course, we will have the lovely Olivia back on May 7th for part 100, X Series 100, part 3, which is a very crucial one, and I think that's going to be important along with the special interview next week. So tonight it's very important that we dig in on what they've been doing in terms of UFO disclosure and this whole UAP task force, and how this is really an idea that they've kept in mind for a while about how they were going to bring out their version, this kind of CIA deep state version of UFO disclosure. And hook, line, and sinker, of course, many people in the UFO field are falling for it. And I guess I can understand that because they were denied it for so long. But as we've explained many times on this show, the CIA is behind that push. They wrote it. It's their signature. The paper is still wet with ink from them pushing this agenda forward. And that's basically just CIA UFO disclosure versus real disclosure, which I'm going to explain. There's a huge difference between what they want and what we want here in the public, trying to find out about this issue. There's a lot of players and a lot of pieces that come together here that we can chart over decades, literally, in the various versions of UFO disclosure that have come up. And unfortunately, the CIA has gone op happy. And so we've been seeing it rolled out through the healthcare system, and we've seen it rolled out through the continuity of government program. But the op that they want to try and that they have not been able to try up to now is the UFO file op. And this is where we're getting into this tonight, because what they've built over the years is they've kind of taken the temperature of the public to see if they could do this, since the public was building toward their own kind of disclosure in any case. So they decided at a certain point, with all the privatization of space that's been going on in other countries now getting involved, and the fact that we can't explain why we haven't sent a man back to the moon since 1972, 50 years to next year. When we look at that, we're kind of going into, you know, an alternate dimension of what we've been told, because you don't just shut down a space program for 50 years. They had an agenda when they pulled it apart, and it just became, oh, look, we have this nice shuttle that's going to go out, and we have this probe that will send to Mars, and so on. In fact, they needed those 50 years to create an entirely different space infrastructure on the public's dime. And in the case of America, lots and lots of missing trillions around this. And that's one of the big pieces that they don't want us to be looking at. Of course, too late, Catherine Austin Fitts has been out there for 2 decades doing this. So we have that knowledge that they've been pilfering these different agencies and the Pentagon, HUD, and so forth out of the government. So where have they been disappearing this huge amount of money to, which is now estimated somewhere more along the $50 trillion line? That's going to be a big key tonight when we start seeing all of this. Hey, they're going to release this UAP report June 25th. How did Marco Rubio get involved? How did Chris Mellon get involved? These are going to be kind of crucial questions that we're going to answer here tonight. And I want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website at darkjournalist.com to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, because some very important shows that we have coming up for you are going to come straight in there. And you know how it is with social media. We're not quite sure how it's all going to play out. And they've been ditching a lot of channels left and right. And that's part of the censorship, which is all part of this controlling the narrative thing, which really they've exposed themselves to such a dramatic degree. As we know, earlier last year, they actually took the ability of the President of the United States to tweet away. Well, when you get to that level for the commander-in-chief who's in charge of the nukes, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. That was a real red line that we stepped over there, thanks to Jack at Twitter, and our friends over at Facebook followed suit. So I think we can think of them literally as vassals of a foreign power. And that's the weirdness of where we are right now. There's a foreign group, namely the CCP, that is influencing these tech companies. But behind that push of the CCP is the Davos crowd, which actually set up and promoted the CCP by transferring our large manufacturing base over from America straight to China. And it was easy to convince certain people that there were benefits to this, of course. So there's a lot of geopolitics around this. The hot zone gets into it as well. So we're looking at a lot of different issues here. What I do want to say is that tonight we're going to come in with the UFO file, but we're going to see how it branches out around the political aspects and some very peculiar CIA directors, former CIA directors, coming forward and just giving some very, very unusual interviews, pushing this UFO file disclosure and also trying to spin their greatest missed opportunity in history, that is the JFK assassination, because they were never able to quite convince the public that the CIA hadn't done JFK in, which in fact all the evidence points to the fact after 60 years that they had, 57 years to be precise. But there's something coming up along that line, and we'll see for some reason the CIA is making noises around the JFK assassination, which is very unusual. But in October, there is the new deadline that was set up by Trump while still in office for the rest of the CIA records to come out. Now, we know those records were originally mandated by Congress in 1992 to come out 25 years. No ifs, ands, or buts. That was a law. And when the date showed up, actually, we were live streaming, expecting them to come out, and the CIA blocked it at the last minute on October 26, 2017. In that window, a lot of weird things started to happen. The whole Q thing showed up. TTSA came out, to the Stars Academy with Tom DeLonge, and the whole freak show that followed that, with the strange, narrated story of Lou Elizondo, Lou of TTSA fame. So that's a very interesting window of time, because right in there, the JFK records were supposed to come out. And although Trump did get some of those records out, he took it, the CIA said, well, we have people who are still, connected with this, and it would threaten our sources and methods, which is absolutely ridiculous, because if you can't, after 57 years, all those agents are dead. And your sources and methods better have changed many times. Some of those countries, like the Soviet Union, doesn't even exist anymore. So, those excuses are absurd. So we have to think about the whole records part when we consider this, when we look at the UFO file as well, because when we're looking at the JFK aspect, they have a big problem with those records, even though I'm convinced there's nothing in those records that will tell us exactly what happened. But there's enough links in those records, especially around the Jim Garrison investigation, because it tied in aerospace to the assassination. And those are the pieces that they don't want out after all this time. And we're going to get into why here in a minute. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. It's not a typical X-Series episode, so we're going to go maybe about an hour and a half tonight to get this very important piece out around this UAP task force and all the things that they've been doing. We've got Groovy out there in the ideas room, and next time around we'll be doing questions, because it's going to be hard to keep up tonight. Okay, let's start with James Woolsey. Woolsey has always been featured as part of the work that I do here, because Woolsey has a very unusual crisscross with the UFO file. One of the interesting personal anecdotes that Catherine Austin Fitz, the former HUD secretary, who's been on this program many times, tells is about this Navy think tank that she was invited into, where they offered her the opportunity to meet aliens, which I thought was really quite fascinating and makes a lot more sense in retrospect. But some of the people involved in that task force, Navy admirals, and but Woolsey was one of those people. I mean, he found out that Fitz was a part of it. He kind of flipped out. And I always thought that was interesting, one, that he was in it, and two, that he flipped out as a result of her being a part of it. She eventually declined because she thought something weird was going on there, and that they didn't want her in there for the reason they called her in. So Woolsey shows up a few times in that UFO thread. There's another famous story of Stephen Greer giving him a briefing, and then Woolsey publicly denying it in very, very heavy terms, saying, you know, I was at a dinner, you approached me, you gave me this information, it wasn't a real briefing, you know, get over it, that kind of thing. But it was odd for a CIA director to go on record against just some UFO researcher. In this case, Stephen Greer, who at the time was, you know, doing his kind of press conference things where he was getting these disclosure press conferences together. That's almost 20 years ago now. When you think about how this field moves, it's very strange. And then once in a while, the CIA comes through with an operation like to the Stars Academy and like this UAP Task Force, and the whole public is sent running after it. Now, however, I do feel that they have to reveal some of what they have, and they also have to spin it that they're heroes. And this is what we're looking at here. They also have to give us their version because we're going to find out our version anyway. Let me go on record here and say that with my background and all the people that I've met over the years, including John Mack, by the way, when I was 19 years old. And Mack was one of the best UFO researchers to ever come around. He was a Harvard professor, and I remember Time magazine just giving him the worst time in history, you know, saying he was really out there and trying to get him barred from Harvard. Of course, they couldn't do it because he had tenure, and but it was quite a kerfuffle, let's say, and a dust-up there in the press over Mack coming forward and saying there is something happening here. These people are being abducted. There is some extra story, and we need to go deeply into this. Subsequently, I met, by accident, Charlie Fultz from the Allagash incident, who told me, you know, in about a half-hour conversation about what happened with them. And it was quite remarkable because that story about the two twins who were mass art teachers and Charlie Fultz, who had just come back from the Marines, going up to fish in the Allagash and being abducted by these kind of insect-type beings wearing coveralls. That story, if you really dig into it, is one of the best UFO cases on record. So over and over again, we've come across excellent UFO cases, witnesses, you know, and I remember when they came out with the Tic Tac video in the New York Times, and I was looking at this stuff and saying, you know, in 1978, a film crew in Australia filmed this thing that looked like the moon around the airport, just kind of circling around for a half hour. And that is so much better than the Tic Tac video. But these things all have their time and place. The Tic Tac video looks heavily tampered with to me, and I've talked to different experts about it. And even guys like Russell Targ, you know, who do a lot of physics experiments related to aviation and things like that. He told me that it wasn't what it was presented as. But we saw over and over again the UFO crowd just kind of jumping on board with that. So this is a problematic piece because we have to be able to separate real UFO file information, the types of stories and the things I was just mentioning to you, like the work of Mack, Stanton Friedman, and others, versus this thing. There's like a creation of the CIA, which they force through the government, and they try to manipulate the public with. And ultimately, I believe that that op is heading towards the alien invasion op. And I've gone on the record before saying, if you thought the coronavirus op was a big, you know, heavy duty op, just wait. just wait. That's not to suggest that the medical issues weren't real, but what they did with it and what they the various things that we're seeing, narratives fall apart wholesale regarding that. But I still feel that the COVID thing, you know, if you think about it, as much of an op as that was, the UFO invasion op is going to be the mother of all ops from the CIA. They've been building it for 70 years, and we have to look at some of the architects. So let's get into Woolsey for a minute, who turns out he's going to attempt to be a twofer. He's going to try simultaneously to blame the Russians for the JFK assassination instead of the CIA, and also to say, hey, we need to find out about those UFOs. They are real after all, even though the CIA has lied about that for over 70 years. All right, New York Post. Ex-CIA director believes UFOs could exist after PAL's plane paused. Let's think about that. How do you pause a plane in midair? You know, we talk a lot about apotheum effects, which is the very unusual effect that comes off of the UFOs and is also related to X technology. So that's the kind of thing where we talk about missing time. And what it is a kind of distortion physics field. And whatever it is that that does, it suspends the universal law of physical reality so that, you know, in abduction cases, we have people walking through walls. We have cities blacked out. We have time running backwards. Those types of strange effects. So now here is the ex-CIA director of the United States going on record on apotheum. He also mentioned steganography, and I'm going to get into that. But maybe he's been watching the X series. We'll find out. I want to say, though, that, you know, John Greenwald from the Black Vault got this interview, and I think they kind of targeted him in a sense. His work, you know, I've always said that John does great work over there at the Black Vault, but also the manipulation is running heavy with Woolsey coming in to the independent sphere, trying to push this narrative. Let's get into this a little bit. Ex-CIA director believes UFOs could exist after PAL's plane paused. Say that 3 times fast. PAL's plane paused. Former CIA director James Woolsey said he believes UFOs could exist after his friend's plane was paused at 40,000 feet and hopes humans would be friendly to extraterrestrials if they ever make contact, according to the report. Now, this is a little bit interesting because everything around TTSA, Marco Rubio, the task force is all about the UFO threat and how there's a big threat and how we need to, you know, watch out for this threat. They may know that the threat part is being exposed by the likes of me and some others, and so they might be trying the softer, hey, actually, the ETs are here to bring joy. My feeling is that they're testing the waters, but they've been pushing the UFO threat op so hardcore that my feeling is that they have to stick with it. So let's go further with this. The former chief spook, who ran the agency from 1993 to 1995, spoke Friday to the Black Vault's John Greenwald, where he promoted his new book with co-author Ion Mihail Parsepa. By the way, Parsepa is dead. He died in February, just as this book was coming out. And I thought that was strange since he was a key agent of Romanian intelligence. But just the fact that, you know, you work in this book with Woolsey about the JFK assassination and then you wind up dead, that's a little bit, some kind of timing, and I'm sure unfortunate in any case. I never thought there was anything to all this, i.e. UFOs. It always seemed pretty far out to me. Oh, yeah, sure. You're the director of the CIA, and you never thought there was anything to UFOs. That's ridiculous. We already know from Greer that you believed in it. So he's just out there playing the narrative. But there was one case in which a friend, this is Woolsey continuing, but there was one case in which a friend of mine was able to have his aircraft stop at 40,000 feet or so and not continue operating as a normal aircraft, Woolsey continued, adding that the source was someone he respects. Was it a hitman? That's a good question. What was going on? I don't know. Does anybody know? He said. there had just been enough things like that that have occurred that I think there will be a lot of examination of what's going on over the course of several months or years. He added, I'm not as skeptical as I was a few years ago. Again, BS around being a skeptic. When you're the CIA director, you get the UFO file. I mean, that's just how it works. He added, I'm not as skeptical as I was a few years ago, to put it mildly, but something is going on that is surprising a series of intelligent aircraft experienced pilots. And there he's coming out with a kind of Lou Elizondo type picture, like, I'm ready to give you disclosure. I think I have one of Lou's handy here. I'm sure we're going to get to it in any case. James Woolsey, during the interview, John Greenwald said other intelligence chiefs have also left open the possibility of extraterrestrial life. In December, ex-CIA Director John Brennan, who we pointed out last year, said it was presumptuous and arrogant to believe there are no other forms of life than the ones on Earth. This is a quote from Brennan. I think some of the phenomena we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might in fact be some type of phenomena that is the result of something we don't yet understand, that could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. How many qualifiers can you have in one sentence? Brennan just broke the record on that. By the way, Brennan is, his nickname is the Drone King because his favorite pastime as CIA director was droning people at weddings. And so when we had someone who was a suspected terrorist, he would cut loose somewhere in Afghanistan and bomb the wedding party of 50 people just to get one guy. So that's the type of people who are saying, we really need that UFO disclosure now. Something tells me we wouldn't be better off if people like that were giving us UFO disclosure. Hopefully we can get some better disclosure than that from those types of really the bottom of the barrel people. In April 2020, the Department of Defense released a statement confirming 3 unclassified Navy videos from 2004 and 2015, each showing unidentified aerial phenomena. Brennan commented on the videos, calling them quite eyebrow-raising. Again, the whole maybe there are UFOs. The CIA, since 1947, they got written into their charter. This is something you'll find in the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's the man who coined the term the deep state, based on geopolitical activities in Turkey, and translated over here, the same types of things meant deep state. So he started to use it and everyone followed suit. But it's very interesting because he talks about when the CIA was originally developed, that their charter left it open that they could never be prosecuted. So there's a piece of that charter which the public has never seen. In other words, they can do anything. And that's been the big problem with the United States and our foreign policy, is it's always had this aspect that's completely out of control. Now, where does the CIA come from? This is a very important question for us to answer. And, later on, I'm going to tie in something about this total recall science fiction idea that actually Philip Dick came up with. That's going to give us some insight into what is going on now. But the Central Intelligence Agency, although the brainchild of Harry Truman, was originally resisted by Truman, who said he didn't want an American Gestapo, which is exactly what it's turned into with its friends, Homeland Security, the NRO, and the NSA. So when we look at this and we see the position that we're in with it, they built in certain safeguards in 1947 so that it could not be smashed in the way that JFK wanted to smash it. It's very interesting because JFK had the most outright, out in the public battle with the Central Intelligence Agency, and we all know how that ended. But the CIA has their own Air Force, and they've developed so much power from overthrowing other countries. We've seen them in a number of different situations, just flouting the rule of law on a dramatic scale. So when we look at their history and we look at the things that they've done, they've accomplished, overthrowing elections, what is it? How did they get into that position? Well, if you really look at the CIA, it wasn't created by military people. It was created actually by Wall Street. because Alan Dulles, we have to remember, was a Wall Street lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell when he really crafted the CIA, becoming its director from 53 to 61. It is the key in New York in those days. Sullivan and Cromwell is that really, kind of elite law firm. But that was the key to international finance. And so the Central Intelligence Agency, they needed a way to guarantee all of Wall Street's assets internationally. And they needed to be able to use American muscle doing it, and then be able over and over again to justify the things that they were doing. Now, there was a group in there called the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC. And this gets us into Frank Wisner and some of those very unusual activities, covert activities that were absolutely appalling. Now, the OPC was this arm that was committing all these types of offenses. And the whole goal was to help the elections in Italy stay out of the hands of the communists. So they were doing all these different types of things and justifying it by saying, hey, we can't let the communists come in there and take over. So as things wore on, however, the leadership, Truman and Eisenhower, became very distressed at the CIA. And Truman in particular said, look, I need you to get the OPC under control. And is there a way, he said this to the director of Central Intelligence Agency, he said, put them under the wing and control of the CIA total. And then what happened was this really out of control covert group that was doing all these types of things to rig elections and, assassinations and all the rest of it. That wing usurped the kind of pencil pusher wing of the CIA, the regular intelligentsia. And that's why in the 50s, all of a sudden, we had the overthrow of Iran, and Mossadegh and all these different things in Guatemala, Arbenz. Suddenly, the United States was in the business of throwing people out of leadership and regime change and all these types of things. That all comes from this weird OPC, ultra Cold War wing that took over the CIA. But OPC was, it exploited the idea of what the CIA had been created for, which was just to give intelligence to the president. That's it. Not to do the Bay of Pigs or to overthrow other countries, or the things that we're seeing today where they're trying to undermine other countries like Russia, for example. And, we spent 4 years where they went through this ridiculous hysteria about Trump as a Russian agent. And regardless of what you think of Trump, all of that turned out to be fake, and they wasted $50 million of the taxpayers' money trying to prove it. So, we have to kind of see that the CIA is so operational now, historically, but right up to the present, into everything that we're dealing with in terms of the COVID crisis, the UFO file reveal, the Russia gate nonsense, rigging elections. That's all Central Intelligence activity. If you look right down the line at all of those things that are happening, it always comes back to the CIA, as does the media manipulation. And this is the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in, coming into their kind of CIA disclosure. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is a special live stream report. I wanted to join you here on Friday and go over some of the really bizarre things that we've been seeing from the CIA and from the UAP Task Force. I want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website and sign up for our newsletter. It's free. It just keeps us in touch. It keeps that real pipeline going between us with the way things are going with social media. We really, they're just censoring everything left and right. And we don't know how long, we'll be on these platforms. But, fundamentally, I've always enjoyed them. And, I'll continue and just keep doing the honest reports that I've been doing. I'm not going to tailor my information. I have seen some different types of people out there saying, well, what I'll do is I'll just won't mention this and this and this on YouTube. And I understand that. But for me, it would be disingenuous because I came into these types of platforms to get away from mainstream media type reporting. And that's what you do in the mainstream media. You don't publish things the publisher doesn't want you to publish. So I couldn't get back into that kind of game again. So I'm just going to completely keep doing the types of reports I'm doing and let the chips fall where they may. Okay, back to Woolsey. A couple of quick things I want to say about Woolsey. And that was his quote from that interview with Greenwald. And like I said, I can understand Greenwald really, that's a good interview to get a former CIA director. Unfortunately, he is trying to spin out through, these different independent sources. But what is Woolsey actually doing? Well, he's talking about UFOs there, but what is he actually doing? He's pushing a book about the JFK assassination and how the CIA wasn't responsible after all. No, it was something called Operation Dragon, according to Woolsey. It was Khrushchev who ordered it. The CIA was trying to protect Kennedy. That's what Woolsey is coming out and pushing, and that's the book that he wrote with this strange Romanian intelligence agent who turned up dead when they were releasing the book. Kennedy was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. The official story crumbled almost immediately, but it was used to create the whole illusion of, some Soviet defector, American defector to the Soviet Union, Lee Harvey Oswald, being responsible. And then when Jim Garrison and other people got into researching it, it became pretty obvious that the Kennedy assassination was organized by the deep state, and the CIA had a major piece of that. So over the years, they've had different meetings and things, and some memos and stuff have got out about them meeting up and saying, how can we change the perception in the public mind about this? Because they, definitely know how to read the polls. And the polls still show about 70% of Americans believe that the official story was a total lie about Oswald, and that he acted alone and all that kind of thing. They know that it's BS, and a good deal of that 70% feel that the CIA was involved, and certainly that the government covered it up. So, we have a lot of things in the culture now that are a punchline, like the magic bullet and things like that, where Oswald was supposed to have shot a bullet that caused 7 wounds and all this kind of ridiculousness. But it is interesting in point that this ex-CIA director comes out and he's talking about 2 key things that in American life have been suppressed by the Central Intelligence Agency when they erected this wall of secrecy. There are more things that they have erected walls of secrecy around, but somehow they need these 2 issues, and this is how they work in tandem. So long as it remains out there that the CIA assassinated President Kennedy, they can never fully be trusted coming forward and saying, we're giving you UFO disclosure. So they're trying to double up on whitewashing that part of it. Even though we're 57 years out from the incident, it's what they're really known for, assassination. So whatever it is they're trying to pull off with the public's trust around the UFO file and the UAP thing and the UFO threat, and we'll save you from the threat with the missing trillions that we pilfer from the government, this is all part of a larger deep state operation. And we can't come into it unawares. I think we need to really come in to it with the idea of understanding that the CIA is manipulating that narrative on behalf of the deep state, of which they are a major part. And when we look at the UFO disclosure, they've held back UFO disclosure, even though so many people have seen UFOs, someone in their family has seen them, some people have had abduction experiences, and now it's their children that have abduction experiences. So this is something in the public's mind, and that they know it. I know a number of people, and I've talked with a number of people who've had these types of encounters. So the idea that we can get disclosure from the government might feel good to someone thinking, hey, I'll go to the kitchen table and I'll be right. All this time I've been talking about aliens and all this stuff, and people laughed at me. Well, now I'll be vindicated. This is exactly the kind of counterintelligence trick that they've been utilizing against us here with this narrative. And it's the very same reason that we see CIA operatives, intelligence operatives coming into what? The alternative space, trying to manipulate that narrative. That's where the whole TTSA thing came out. And in the mainstream, it's actually, they all have to line up and talk about it now. They can't even avoid talking about it. As a matter of fact, the stories are getting so hardcore. This story I found was particularly interesting out of the Wall Street Journal. You don't expect to see UFO or alien stories in the Wall Street Journal, let's face it. It's a financial publication, but nonetheless, here it is. Alien languages may not be entirely alien to us. This one I found very interesting. Evolution should favor some universal traits in the emergence of any kind of communications on any planet. Basically saying, yeah, we know it's going to be weird when we fake this alien intervention invasion that they speak English, but, it's because English evolves universally on all planets. It's like on Star Trek, whenever they land, everyone speaks English. So I guess it makes sense. But I found this interesting. Human contact with alien civilizations, this is from the article, may be more likely than we think. A recent NASA study estimated that there should be at least 4 habitable planets, and probably more, within 32 light years of Earth, a cosmic stone's throw away. How witty. These planets could just now be receiving our television broadcasts of the 1989 inauguration, President George H.W. Bush. But would aliens understand those broadcasts? Would we understand aliens? Could we ever intercept their languages? And they go on to suggest that actually we'll be able to interpret, because language is universal, and that we'll use certain language signals, and that it'll all be hunky-dory. But nonetheless, everyone from conservative financial publications like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, to Fox News, to the Huffington Post, they all now have to come on the same side on this UFO issue. They cannot be ridiculing it. They've got marching orders, because whatever they're going to reveal, and we should talk about how they're going to get to that reveal, but whatever they're going to reveal, they have to be all lined up around the same narrative, or else it's going to be a chaotic reveal, and it's going to destroy any opportunity that they have to pull it off, which I think, an alien invasion idea, or that there's an alien threat, is going to be, it's a very tricky thing, because you'd be unleashing a lot of paranoia, and you'd be unleashing a lot of awareness and questioning, so that, I'm sure they're measuring a lot of what they've done with COVID to see the kind of metrics that they get out of it. Let's go a little bit further with this. The UAP Task Force, which is Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, which is the term they're trying to rebrand UFOs with. That's another very careful piece. Remember when the USA was they were trying to merge it and make the name Homeland? It's a very interesting thing with names, because names have traits. The United States has a constitution. The Homeland just has the connotation of defending against terrorists. They're two very different things. Homeland, Deutschland, this is what Hitler was using when he was coming to power. Everything was about the homeland. So when we did Homeland Security, I was like, it's very disturbing. When they started going beyond their regular mandate of just looking for terrorists and doing things like busting flea markets, I thought, we're in very deep trouble. When they went even further and they grew the agency to 250,000 people, that is Homeland Security, they have 250,000 employees. Think about that. That's very, very disturbing bureaucracy. All right, so here it is. Thanks to Trump-era COVID relief bill, UFO report may soon be public, and it'll be big, ex-official says. This is how we kind of got into this game. The aforementioned Lou was somebody who was out there early on the spot, and he worked directly for James Clapper, and he worked, who's the director of national intelligence under Obama, and he also worked for John Brennan, who's the director of central intelligence, aka the Drone King. Elizondo came in with the TTSA thing, and they really rolled him out to be like, I was the head of the secret UFO program. And in fact, he worked very deeply in the government, but he never led a UFO program. This is part of the problem with Elizondo, is the lying, the public lying, which good researchers unmasked immediately with his inconsistent statements, which is what the CIA tends to do. The other thing is that everyone on the shows that he was on, like George Knapp and stuff, gave him softball questions like, how does it feel to be that heroic? And also, what do you think about being a hero? And other good questions like that. So there was no, are you still working for the government? And is this just an operation? And how can you prove that it isn't? And if you're not working for the government, where are you working? And, going beyond just how things looked on the surface. But over and over again in the UFO field, the UFO field has a lot of problems that the assassination researchers and the deep state researchers don't have. And this is something I come back to because I think it would help the UFO field to get on this. They don't seem to understand how government secrecy works, and they don't seem to understand how manipulative the CIA is. They seem to trust all this stuff, and they talk about the government not giving them records and things like that, but they don't understand the deeper levels of how that deep state manipulates internationally as a global power system. And they don't understand that they use lethal tools and all the rest of it. So the UFO field kind of fumbles around, and once in a while it chums up with all the CIA people trying to spin different narratives. And that's a real failing, I would say, because a lot of the deep state researchers understand the government aspects, the agency aspects, and also when those agencies do overreach a lot better. So having some kind of real solid political research background, I think would help the UFO field. And I think that what we're seeing in the public, this is going to be tricky for us because the average person is going to hear about aliens and just think, hey, it's aliens. And so that's going to be that little weird UAP Task Force type narrative, the CIA disclosure narrative, and the kind of malarkey narrative. And then it's going to splinter off with UFO file research, which is the really solid research we mentioned at the beginning, like Mack and Friedman, and the things that we do here on this program, the work of G.G. Young, Dr. Joseph Farrell. That's real UFO file research. And in my opinion, that is going to split off from this other stuff, which is really like a marketing sideshow. And very, very deadly in terms of what the CIA plans to do with it. All right, so going a little bit further on this task force, this is the very short Pentagon press release where they announced it August 14th, 2020, under President Trump. And that's about the size of it. And here we go. On August 4th, 2020, Deputy Secretary of Defense David Norquist approved the establishment of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena UAP Task Force, UAPTF. Remember I told you that they were leaking like a sieve, and now they're not leaking, to sort of regular journalists. They're leaking stuff off to this filmmaker guy who made a film about Bob Lazar and didn't really ask the hard questions there. And then you see this task force, like already they just established and they're leaking all this stuff already. Like, look, there's a pyramid UFO. And the images aren't very good. And a lot of the things that we're seeing, again, are coming in under this weird, the way that it's coming through, where they leak something, somebody gets it, they put it out, and then people say, is that real? And then the military comes in and says, yes, it's real, but we don't want to talk about it. That's a really weird triangle of action and activity that I think the CIA has set up here for this. It keeps the guessing game going about what's happening. But in any case, the Department of Defense established the UAPTF to improve its undertaking of and gain insight into the nature and origins of unidentified aerial phenomena. The mission of the task force is to detect, analyze, and catalog UAPs that could potentially pose a threat to U.S. national security. So it's established literally, not for scientific study. It's literally the UFO threat is embedded in its charter here. As DoD has stated previously, the safety of our personnel and the security of our operations are of paramount concern. The Department of Defense and the military department take any incursions by unauthorized aircraft into our training ranges or designated airspace very seriously and examine each report. They have for 80 years. When we were, in World War II flying over Germany, sorties to bomb the hell out of it, we had all of the UFOs that were following and flying in formation. All those pilots gave us that notice. So none of this stuff is new. In the 1950s, they actually sat down and talked with presidents and generals, and they would say, well, we don't know what the UFOs are, but they don't seem to be a national security threat. So, and little by little, they would trail off more and more. The next person to really bring it up in earnest, I mean, Kennedy brought it up very seriously behind the scenes, but in earnest in the public, it was Jimmy Carter and then Reagan. So, that's a long wave, 20 some odd years from the Truman years. So this includes examinations of incursions that are initially reported as UAP when the observer cannot immediately identify what he or she is observing. So they've always had these protocols. Project Blue Book was such a protocol in the 60s. So this isn't anything new. However, what they're planning to do is give us more than they have given before with a spin. And the spin is, this is a UFO threat, and this is the reason why we've been doing things in secret. So they're hoping to cover themselves in relation to this. But there's some weird effort in the middle of the CIA to somehow retread history into the fact that they weren't the ones stonewalling the public on the UFO file, and also that they weren't the ones who were guilty of assassinating President Kennedy. This is what, we're in the middle of a reality battle here when we're looking at these things. So it's very tricky when we get into it and the CIA is promoting a certain line, and then you see people who've been studying along the UFO line for a while, and they start getting wrapped up inside of the ops that the CIA is running, and it looks, the manipulation goes really well. And then you have these people who just kind of wander into the field, make a movie or write a book or something, and Fox and people like that are like, hey, come on our station and we'll talk to you like you're a UFO expert. And what happens in that case is they don't have enough of the background to understand exactly the secrecy and the levels of secrecy that are involved, and how the CIA is manipulating that, and how it's very bad for our country and the world. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is a special live stream report for you on the UAP Task Force and this major report that's coming out in June. We're watching this closely, and I will say that in relation to this task force, that they have attempted to leak things my way as well. And my feeling is, in general, that these types of things, that the task force is set up so loosely to study these things that, it becomes almost absurd the way that they're leaking information so quickly to all these different people. And so my suggestion actually is, don't take the bait if that's the type of information that you're getting. Okay, let's move. I do want to plug in the Rubio part here. I've mentioned this before, but U.S. Navy UFO Task Force exists, and Senator Marco Rubio wants its data on aerial phenomena threats. Here is Rubio, who's our new point man on the UFO file. It's interesting. Rubio is the senator from Florida. We've got Cape Canaveral in Florida, a major NASA presence. We're also talking about the hot zone there, very close to AUTEC, the underwater Area 51, and all the unusual things around the Bermuda Triangle, and the various anomalies and UFO sightings that happen in that hot zone area, along with ancient ruins under the water, under Bimini, and the different bizarre things that we've done a series of reports on the hot zone here on this program. So his being from Florida is very, very interesting. And what it reminds me of, and I'm going to have us walk back in time here to a very unusual story that happened in the hot zone, the Isle of Grenada. This is pretty interesting. Let's start with this. The United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. They're actually having a planetary defense conference 2021 taking place on Monday. The United Nations planetary defense. Well, who are they defending against? A UFO threat. Where did that little division come from? It's pretty interesting history, actually, when you get into it. There was a leader in Grenada who was particularly interested in the UFO file subject, and he had taken over. The U.S. had used him as a strongman in a number of different situations, but oddly enough, a few things came out about his push for UFO disclosure that I think are going to help us. One of the odd things that stumbled out of that file was this very unusual picture of the UFOs that had been seen over Grenada. That's just odd that the Egyptian Ankh is embedded in the middle of this one. I found that particularly interesting when it tumbled out in these files. But here's the article, "Behold the sky full of such mischief," British UFO files say. These are some files that came out in 2011 relating to the 1970s in Britain. But this leader of Grenada had a very strong relationship with Britain. And so we're going to see how this happened. London, the year was 1977. Above the tiny island nation of Grenada, big things were happening in the sky. Sir Eric Gary, the country's first prime minister, was convinced that the objects he thought he was seeing were hostile alien aircraft from outer space. The British government did not share Sir Eric's conviction that, as he put it, this is his quote, "Persons from outer space are studying us or perhaps living among us as earthlings." This is a leader of a major island. "A ridiculous proposal that will only bring the United Nations into disrepute," was what one British official called the Prime Minister's campaign to persuade the United Nations to form an agency to investigate UFOs. That agency, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, came about eventually as a result of this guy's efforts. Here's a few other things that tumbled out in his file. One of the things I found interesting are these stamps, which are actual stamps from 1977, where he created this whole array of UFO images so that Grenada could be known for UFOs. Now, he's there, down there in the hot zone, the Caribbean, and he's talking all about these different things relating to UFOs. I have part of his speech here, which is going to fascinate you when I get to it, because this guy was very deep into things, and what ended up happening was he and the astronaut Gordon Cooper went directly to the United Nations and said, "We want you to develop this whole interactive thing so we can talk to aliens through the United Nations." It's pretty interesting. That's kind of interesting company, thinking about it. The president of Grenada and a major Gemini astronaut. What are they doing in cahoots back then? Let's find out. Okay, New York Times, actually Time Magazine, even earlier. "Everyone in Grenada suspected that the island's prime minister, Sir Eric Gary, 56, was a black magic nut as well as a UFO freak. Still, Grenadians were astonished last week by the cache of bizarre objects Sir Eric left behind when he went to the U.S. earlier this month. His well-timed departure came just before a coup that ousted him after 12 years of oppressive rule over the Caribbean island." He was a major U.S. strongman. What's also interesting is that the Reagan administration went on to invade Grenada, which was the first major military activity on behalf of the United States since the Vietnam War. Kind of significant. On display at his residency atop picturesque Mount Royal last week were a donkey's eye, a mysterious white powder, Presumably, these had been part of the spooky voodoo-like rituals that the deposed prime minister is said to have practiced to help keep himself in power. Huge stacks of books and magazines on UFOs and other astral bodies were reminders of the Grenadians' leaders' principal foreign policy concern. On 3 separate occasions in the past 5 years, this article was written now in the late 70s. On 3 separate occasions in the past 5 years, he had proposed that the United Nations undertake studies of UFOs, which he insisted were space vehicles used by aliens of extraterrestrial origin. The revolutionaries managed to oust Sir Eric's warlockocracy and the loss of only 3 lives on the morning of March 13th. 45 members of the opposition New Jewel movement stormed Sir Eric's True Blue Defense Force barracks. They arrested 100 soldiers who were sleeping and unarmed. At the time, Sir Eric's government ministers were routed out of bed and confined to the garden of the local prison. So they really wanted to get rid of this guy because he was blabbing on too much about aliens. The fire station quickly ran up a white flag of surrender, actually a shirt borrowed off the back of a friendly passerby. And so on, this kind of strange coup goes. The leader of the coup, Maurice Bishop, a British-educated lawyer, immediately set up a 14-member Revolutionary Council. I'll tell you what's interesting about this is that David Atlee Phillips, who was a major mastermind for the CIA and the Kennedy assassination, used to use the pseudonym Maurice Bishop. So I think Maurice Bishop is just this go-to name for the CIA. Okay, what can we really get from this? There's more details, but basically we have someone who's into black magic. We have someone who is using voodoo rituals, they're saying. Or are they maybe just trying to make him more and more bizarre because of his UFO interest and because he brought up the United Nations, which he was not supposed to do? And did they eventually need to actually invade the country, not just oust him as a result of this? Let's go a little bit further with our friend, Sir Eric. These are more of those stamps, which are just an interesting reminder of a small nation trying to bring the UFO file out. Oh, gee, some 40 years before the TTSA came along. Okay, here we go, some more. Proposal to appoint expert group to study nature and origin of UFOs. Grenada proposed that the Secretary General appoint a group of experts under the aegis of the Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That's also a big no-no, by the way. Anytime you want to go for peaceful use of outer space, you're going to be in trouble. To define guidelines for a UN study of the nature and origin of unidentified flying objects and related phenomena, the Prime Minister of Grenada, Sir Eric Gairy, spoke at the Special Political Committee to introduce the draft resolution. That was in November of 1977. This is his speech given at the UN, which I think is going to be kind of an interesting flashback for us here. Okay, I'm going to read just this section that I've excerpted. I offer my heartiest congratulations to the government and people of the Solomon Islands and welcome that state as a member of this body. During our 4 years of membership in the United Nations, we've raised many matters of importance, some of which have been considered innovative, others were current and regular, but our views were ushered in new thoughts about them, thoughts that aroused new vistas in an attempt to tackle traditional thought patterns. And still further, we've been introducing some very thought-provoking subjects of world importance and world concern, subjects considered by some to be strange and extraneous, but which we feel are sufficiently important and significant to merit our constant articulation and review of them. The question of women's rights, the universality of God, economic cruelty, the problems of man and his environment, disarmament, man and his material and spiritual behavior, the Bermuda Triangle, unidentified flying objects, and extraterrestrial phenomena, decolonization, territorial integrity, human rights, and undue solace given terrorists. It is my desire to make a contribution to the subject of new international economic order relating to third world countries. So we can see how this conversation goes. It sounds very normal. He's going through it, and then he just throws in Bermuda Triangle, UFOs, extraterrestrial contact, aliens among us. Quote, Grenada is concerned and feels a sense of frustration over the seemingly endless dialogue that has been proceeding in international forums on the establishment of a new international order. Indeed, we in Grenada are grateful for the consideration we've received from the North through the existing Lomé Convention. Grenada welcomes the action taken by the Caribbean Group for Cooperation on Economic Development. And so laced throughout his comments are all these, it's almost like blackmail in a sense, where he's saying, you know, we support it when you give us money to equalize the situation. It's almost like he is giving them an ultimatum to say, you know, there's all this stuff about the Bermuda Triangle and aliens that I can let out. And by the way, we're talking about economic independence, financial independence for all these island nations. What do you think? And so what's interesting, what happens to him is he gets deposed and he comes back to the United States. And where does he go to live but Coronado? Now, we don't have time for me to get into Coronado, but there's the next series episode, a few episodes ago, all about Coronado and the very unusual things that took place down there in San Diego relating to the aerospace end of things. And it ties directly in with, for example, the USS Nimitz and these different various sightings. All of that is based out of these bases in San Diego, tied directly in with Coronado, where all of the aerospace and intelligence aspects reside, along with its very unusual connection with the Wizard of Oz movie, which we detailed in that episode. So something is very interesting there. And I think when we look at the things that he's talking about, he includes the Bermuda Triangle. That is, in essence, pointing out we have a hot zone problem. And the hot zone problem relates to this unusual magnetic field that is the result of something down there in the hot zone. We've pointed out that in the work of Edgar Casey, he talks all about the Two-Eyes Stone and how that took the entire area of Atlantis down, and it was their highest point of technological achievement turned in reverse to cause massive inundations. This is an echo in that area of the magnetic disturbances. So that area is an incredible what? It's an incredible UFO hotspot. So we find ourselves surrounded in this conversation around UFOs with this aspect relating to things that have actually taken place, like the president of Grenada coming forward to the United Nations. Again, this group that he established there at the UN by addressing this is still operational, and they're having a conference starting Monday on planetary defense. So there's a lot to understand when we get into the UFO file about geopolitics, because we are so far behind. And the government has had this information and material for some 75 years. Now, the idea of them giving that to us is not going to happen. The idea of, you know, trusting the CIA with disclosure is like going to the KKK for a togetherness rally. It's not going to happen. And you wouldn't expect it to happen. So this whole getting excited about UFO disclosure through the CIA is a joke, basically. And in terms of getting real UFO information and on a par with something we can actually use, it goes back again to the real research of the UFO file. And that relates directly to the X technology. That's where disclosure can come through. This other thing, that's kind of the split in the road. You know, there's going to be a lot of marketing. There's going to be a lot of hype. There's going to be a lot of things around the UAP Task Force announcements. There's going to be a lot of CIA control of the media celebrating. And remember, the CIA goes, you know, with those puppet strings, and that's it. You know, the media all runs and responds, and they have to play out that narrative that the CIA has put forward. This is the nature of where we are with a lot of this, and we have to kind of look at it straight in the face and say, this is what it's really all about. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep now on this special report. And, you know, there is a piece in there where I said CIA total recall. And there's a reason for that. And it brings us into that very, very unusual movie, which came out in 1990. I think it was done in 1989. And it's got Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sharon Stone. And it is an excellent movie. And it was the largest budget for any movie at the time, $60 million. So they were really set up there to put something across. And it all takes place in the year 2084. But it comes from a Philip K. Dick story. And I want to just do a little bit of this. The name of the actual book that it came from is We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. And I agree that Total Recall is a better name. But anyway, he wrote the book in 1966. And just straight up, it's a short story, first published in April 1966. It features a melding of reality, false memory, and real memory. So what happens in the movie is, this Douglas Quaid goes, and he's a construction worker. He has a normal life, and Sharon Stone's his wife. And he goes and sees this company called Recall, and they tell him they can implant this secret agent life into his mind, and that he'll be on Mars and all this stuff. And interestingly enough, what happens is they break his cover, which is he already has a cover going on. And so that whole personality comes out, and then he finds himself having to go to Mars. And there's a very hardcore piece where he's running away from these people now that his cover has been blown. And when he goes to Mars, they are using oxygen in order to enslave the population. So they restrict oxygen in certain areas. And I'm sure many of you have seen the movie, but just in a real tight nutshell, what's interesting about the movie is it's all about these alien mines and the alien pyramids. And in those mines, they have the ability, there's rumors that there's technology left over. And the idea is that if the regular population can get to those mines and press the technology to come back on, all the oxygen will be there, and the ruling class will no longer have any power over them. And so what the ruling government is trying to do is blow up those mines. So this is very interesting to me. And again, Philip K. Dick is somebody who saw into these things very, very deeply, whether that was his own psychic sense or his own connections, which he had both. There's something fascinating about that, because I think that it predicts a lot of the situation that we're talking about now, because with all the space activity and all the things that we've seen, as we mentioned at the start of the program, you cannot have a program like the space program, which is thriving and going to Mars, and then suspend it for 50 years and say, we're not going back to the moon. It's absurd. So there's no explanation for that. But they have announced they're going back on 2024. Under Mike Pence, they announced that. So we have an interesting situation that's been set up there. And the question is, why? What is it? And are we talking with this big press into space? Have they found ruins on different planets, on the moon? We know Buzz Aldrin mentioned that on Phobos, there was an obelisk. He thought it was very significant. He's let out different things over the years. But is this part of the action? And if you think of Total Recall and what they're trying to attempt there, they're actually trying to smooth over those aspects so the public doesn't get curious about the alien part, and that they don't find out about it and empower themselves by activating that technology. When I think about the CIA, they're worried. They're always worried about maintaining power for the ruling class, and this is their mission. So when I think about the amount of disinformation they're flowing in with the UAP Task Force and all the rest of it, I have to wonder to myself if they aren't thinking the public will independently discover this on their own in relation to the UFO file, and therefore we need to give them a version of it which is a totally fake version. And that's what I think the great danger is that we see ourselves wandering into. Let's see how much they are pushing this, though, and then I'll go back to Total Recall. Where does Space Force go after Trump leaves office? this was something that was asked just before Trump got out, because there were starting to be all of these little signs, these telltale signs that they were going to scrap. There were all these little articles and things from the Washington Post and all the rest saying, you know, they really should scrap the Space Force. And then when Biden got in, he showed no enthusiasm for it. And his press secretary, Psaki, she came up and laughed at the Space Force as soon as a question was asked about it. And even the press were like, what's going on here? You know, Space Force is the first armed service that has been announced since 1947 or created. It's just like the Army. It's just like the Air Force. So what we're talking about really here is space activity. However, it is the Air Force that has most of the space responsibility still. The Space Force is now set up to start taking that. My original deduction in this whole thing, after really analyzing the situation, is that the Trump administration and Trump had decided the only way to get that power of the UFO file back under the presidential control, which is something since Kennedy they've been trying to do, since Eisenhower lost it to private aerospace interests, was to form something that would control that aspect in space. And so the Space Force is that. But the problem was Trump expected to have that second term to be able to do it. So now when Biden inherits the Space Force, it's honeycombed with all the Trump people. And Trump, with his own very unusual connection to the UFO file through his uncle, who was the protege of Vannevar Bush, who we know was in charge of the UFO file. So we find ourselves in a strange situation there where geopolitically they've set up this thing. This was Trump's version of getting it under his wing. The Hillary Clinton, John Podesta version, what was that? It was the TTSA. And the TTSA was meant to do all these disclosures through the New York Times and all the rest of it. But surprise, surprise, Hillary didn't get in. So the whole situation then gets turned around and they decide we're going to run the op anyway, even though Trump's in, which is why the Elizondo DeLong, that whole thing, that freak show of the TTSA went so awry and had so many different failed incarnations. And, you know, we have to remember that the TTSA has over 100 years, think of that, 100 years of CIA experience on its executive board. You know, and they're fast dissolving now. They're $50 million in debt. People are jumping off it like rats off a sinking ship. But it's pretty interesting to me that they were in this position, and that as soon as Biden got in, Mellon got out from the TTSA. Elizondo, you know, their TV show got canceled, and Elizondo went off, and he's doing his own things about disclosure in the UAP Task Force. And they've set up, you know, there's all this ping-ponging stuff going on where this website got set up called The Debrief. And they started leaking things the day that they were out there. And they were being cited for this report that they had. So they put together this site called The Debrief. And then they had like CNN and all these other people picking up, oh, you know, it was the Batman balloon release. So somebody had set up and said, I want to be able to get this thing through the press, but I can't give it directly to CNN. I need something that looks like a UFO, something to give it to them. And then they can say, oh, it's this thing. So that's the way that that strangeness is working. And of course, I mean, around the UFO field, there's all kinds of people who mean well, et cetera. I'm talking about the CIA manipulation of those different types of groups. And in TTSA, it was the most obvious, you know. But this is the nature of the problem when you get around that, because of the nature of the op they want to do is so global that they need to be able to control our attitude towards these things. We can't have our own opinions about the alien thing, because if we do, it spoils what they're up to. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is a very special report to get us all kind of on the same page with the UAP Task Force release coming up. Their special report, June 25th is when it's scheduled for. Marco Rubio is swinging a banner saying, you know, UFOs are a threat, and we need to add to the Defense Department budget to deal with this threat. We don't know where it's coming from, but it's a threat. And, you know, the idea of UFO threats is interesting because we always have legitimate concerns. They've had legitimate concerns. What they deduced in different eras, and that they said, well, you know, like Truman, for example, came forward and said, well, we're watching it, but it's not a national security threat, so we don't need to tell you about it. And this is where the disconnect happened, really. And so we've built up so much distance between the truth of the matter and the kind of wall of secrecy and the public mind that we have a real schizophrenic situation going on, especially in American life, but around the world. And so this is a really big problem because the UFO file, assassinations, 9/11, the COVID crisis, we don't get the truth anymore from the media organizations or from the government instruments. So it leaves a kind of cycle of disrespect going on between the public and the leadership, and eventually that ends up in a very bad place. So, but what we're getting is a lot of misinformation. And in relation to the UAP Task Force, they're controlling the media with this buildup to this report. But who knows what they're actually going to let out about it. But it seems inevitable that what's been happening in that 50-year gap between the last time we went to the moon and 2024, when we're going back, is they've controlled and taken the public's money and all the missing trillions and built a gigantic infrastructure in space to control first the globe and then moving on. But that entire infrastructure that's been built has been built in secret using continuity of government rules. So it's running outside of the US Constitution. So we have a really big problem. So when I mentioned Space Force earlier, I was saying that was Trump's attempt to pull this UFO file aspect back under presidential control. Right now, it's being managed heavily by a group in between the aerospace wing of the military and the CIA. I call the group X-Protect because they're largely in control of it. And the consequences for people going up against X-Protect have always been really, you know, it's been really bad for people trying to get the truth out. And we've seen that since the 1950s and 60s, when all those UFO researchers would get disgraced or, you know, out of a job or dead. And this goes all the way through, you know, Mac Tawney's and people like that in the 90s and the 2000s. So I think when we look at it, there's another group in there I've pointed out called X-Share, who wants to move the culture forward. And we've seen maybe the best of those types, the Kennedys and so on. There are those moves, and even Reagan became more on the X-Share side later in his presidency. So certainly the Trump aspect leans more into the X-Share piece. But, you know, there was a bombast, really, approach around the whole thing and around the Space Force. So that's not very obvious to people on the outside. What's interesting is everybody, X-Protect and X-Share, everybody knows that some aspect of this is going to get out. And so I think the good people are trying to get the real information out to move the culture forward. And I think X-Protect is trying to, after years of keeping a kind of stranglehold on that information with the major secrecy, now they're in a position where they're like, we are going to really bring this forward with our own spin. We're heroes for fighting evil aliens. That's where they're heading with this. And, you know, you, average American or average person of the world, are going to have to suck it up, because the aliens are going to be so dangerous that when we pull this off, there could be alien viruses, you know, there could be all these different types of things of how dangerous the aliens are around our nukes and all the rest. You know, everyone's an enemy agent and everyone's collaborating. If you think the Russian off was bad, wait till it's aliens. So we're getting sort of lured into a bad situation. I think what we can do is snapshot it enough in advance. You know, we have so many other crises going on, and we see how they've manipulated those. But the UFO file one, we can see them manipulating it far ahead. And we've already been pointing it out for years that this is what they're doing. So this is the nature, I think, of the awareness that we can bring to it, instead of just showing up on some show and going along with it and saying, I can't wait for that UAP task force. You know, it has nothing to do with disclosure, actually. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going to try to get a few things in. Let's say this. Let's say we'll go till 10 o'clock. It's great to have so many familiar faces out there. Groovy Bean is doing an ace job running the Ideas Room, which is fantastic. And Groovy's up to some very interesting things, which I'm sure she'll be letting out soon. All right. President Biden congratulates Mars helicopter Ingenuity team for historic first flight. Here is Biden stumbling around in utter disarray. But Biden can't move forward on the Space Force because it is Trump's baby. So what can he do? He has to find a way in on that space piece. And, you know, the whole thing that he might be able to parlay this UAP task force thing. But what's interesting is another person has really laid claim to the UAP task force, and that's Rubio. And remember, the task force was formed under the Trump administration as well. So as far as I can tell, there's a problem there on the Biden side about how they claim the UFO file, because the CIA certainly holds that major piece of the secrecy around the UFO file. But the CIA's loyalties move around. You know, like, let's say Biden and his son hit a real China scandal. They would switch their loyalty immediately to somebody else, you know. And they had an intense hatred for Trump, not because he was a freedom fighter and all these different things. He certainly believed in freedom more than the CIA does. But it's because he's not somebody who wants to... you know, President Trump didn't have the, I'm going to kiss up to these guys to get what I want. He had more of the, I'm the big cheese and I get all the information and you have to cater to me. And they were like, we just have to spend every ounce of energy we have to get rid of this guy. And Trump going in there had the information from his uncle, had the information from Roy Cohn. If you go deep, you will go around 1970 and find something called the Torbett document, which is a very early version of WikiLeaks, and very important information in there about a group called Defense Industrial Security Command, who made flying saucers, basically out of reversed engineered alien technology. This is very important. It's a crucial piece in all this because Roy Cohn is listed as a member of all that. If Cohn is related to this, and he is Trump's mentor, and Trump, who we revealed on this program, was very close to Richard Nixon, and we revealed that in 2018, and a lot of people were like, you know, are you sure, you know, and all the rest of it. Now they come out last fall, all the major publications, and said there was a major relationship between Trump and Nixon that wasn't previously known. And we found all these letters and all this different interaction. Well, if you were watching the work that we were doing, you'd already know that Trump and Nixon had that relationship. The question is, what is it based on really? And was Trump's presidency something that Nixon gave him the background for? There's no question, based on the research that we've done here, that that's exactly how it worked. But Nixon had incredible knowledge around that UFO file, which means Trump going in had the same, which means the Space Force is very significant in relation to this. The task force, my feeling is that's the military's manipulated by the CIA version of all this. And so, as I said, I don't think they had any particular loyalty to either Trump or Biden. But I think that we can see the people who are associated with the task force, Rubio, somehow they may try for President Rubio to do this. They're looking for a real angle in all this. And this is what we're watching out for. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. As I said, we're going to go to 10. I have a few more things for you. I want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website, sign up for the newsletter, because that's something that keeps us in touch. And if you go to darkjournalist.com, just take a couple minutes to sign up and place your email in there. It gives us a direct pipeline, and that's a free newsletter. What will happen is you'll be getting all this different information and the shows that are coming up. While you're there, you can subscribe to the show, get behind the efforts of what we're doing here on the program. And it's great, really, to have all of you with us. I'm going to take a few minutes here to get through a few more things. We recently passed the 2-year anniversary of the taking of Julian Assange of Wikipedia fame for all the things that he had revealed. And I really, that's kind of a grim piece on WikiLeaks. There are some very unusual WikiLeaks files around UFOs, but they never, it's an interesting thing that happened there, is they never came forward fully and got behind this. I think because of what they were after. But the CIA played a major role in bagging Julian Assange, and it happened during the Trump presidency, and Trump didn't come forward as many people thought he might and give Assange a pardon. I think it's unfortunate because he had the ability there to really show that he was for an open and free press, which he was the victim of the opposite during his whole presidency. So let's do a quick run through on a couple of these. I wanted to point something strange out that's related to this, and I'm going to explain why, but some of it is also a mystery, I'm not going to lie. Okay, you may have heard a story about the Postal Service being hired by the Biden administration to spy on your social media posts. A lot of weird things have happened with the post office. One, they've been trying to get rid of them in rural areas, which I think is very dangerous. And I think that they should be in rural areas, and I don't think that they should be, doing this kind of pushback in the Postal Service. However, this is very disturbing. The Postal Service is running a covert operations program that monitors Americans' social media posts. So it's not even a theory. We know this to be a fact, that Biden has come in to those post office forces and given them a program to spy on us, literally, which is what the Stasi used to do in East Germany. And basically the idea is anything that happens, since they're watching it, they can instantly correlate it to the social media person's mailing address and spy on their mail. It's as simple as that. It's about as unconstitutional as you get, as is the legislation they're trying to introduce around domestic terrorism, which is really an absurd way of saying anyone who doesn't think like we do. There are very few actually domestic terrorists, and what they do, they're actually on the wane if you look at this, but in the media they've really put it out there. Oh my God, there's terrorists, and they're domestic. So we all remember 9/11 and the things we went through there, and everyone was a terrorist, right? Everyone coming in from another country, and there were constant threat terrorism assessments, orange alert, yellow alert. And that all came out of the Homeland Security thing post 9/11. And there were, all the unanswered questions around 9/11, including Judy Wood's work and all the rest. I mean, just phenomenal that they pulled this off. But in any case, what they got out of it was this strange thing where everyone was a terrorist, so we had to watch out for it. Now, what they've done is they've tried to take that operation of watching the terrorists and lay it out and making the regular American citizens terrorists. So if you say something that, is out of line with the government on COVID on social media, they start tracking your mail. Now, it's a very extensive program, more extensive than I thought when I first glanced at it. And also I thought, this is a very strange organ of the government, the post office, to be using, especially since it's independent in essence. But I remembered a story that came up, which was very unusual, which was, why are federal bureaucrats buying guns and ammo? $158 million spent by non-military agencies. When I went into that story, I found that one of those agencies was the post office. Post Office purchased a large amount of ammo back in 2014. U.S. Postal Service joins in federal ammo purchases. That is April 2014, some 7 years ago. These were weird moves under the Obama administration where they were arming up federal agencies that hadn't been armed before. It's a very unusual process that was taking place. And so when I saw the Postal Service doing this, I started to wonder what is going on now under the Biden administration. It's like they're picking up where Obama left off on this. Let's read just a little tiny bit of this. The law enforcement arm of the U.S. Postal Service has been quietly running a program that tracks and collects Americans' social media posts. I'm not kidding. Including those about planned protests, according to a document obtained by Yahoo News. Think about this. Yahoo is really coming into their own. The details of the surveillance effort, known as ICOP, Internet Covert Operations Program, have not previously been made public. This just came out on the 21st. The work involves having analysts trawl through social media sites to look for the document, a document described as inflammatory postings, and then sharing that information across government agencies. Analysts within the United States Postal Inspection Service, Internet Covert Operations Program, monitored significant activity regarding planned protests occurring internationally and domestically on March 20th, 2021. Says the March 16th government bulletin, marked as law enforcement sensitive and distributed through the Department of Homeland Security's fusion centers. The fusion centers were unconstitutional to start with. They were run through the FBI and other areas, but they would allow all of this sharing of someone's personal information, your driver's license, the history of the houses you had, whether you were divorced or not, into this gigantic database, which is completely unconstitutional, but was allowed under the Patriot Act. Locations and times have been identified for these protests, which are being distributed. By the way, it's not a crime to protest. Being distributed online across multiple social media platforms to include right-wing leaning Parler and Telegram accounts. Now, this is fascinating to me, right? You should, if you're going to do a program like this, you should lay it out equally across the board. You should look at, threats involving leftists, extreme leftists, or extreme right, or whatever it happens to be, but no right-wing leaning Parler and Telegram accounts, who are basically enemies of Twitter because they're competition, right? A number of groups were expected to gather in cities around the globe on March 20th as part of a worldwide rally for freedom and democracy to protest everything from lockdown measures to 5G. Oh, gee. I mean, yeah, protesting 5G now gets you on a list. That's good. Quote, Parler users have commented about their intent to use the rallies to engage in violence. Image 3 on the right is a screenshot from Parler indicating two users discussing the event as an opportunity to engage in a fight. I mean, this is not deep stuff. This is what they're spending your money on. The bulletin includes screenshots of posts about the protests from Facebook, Parler, Telegram, and other social media sites. Individuals mentioned by name include one alleged Proud Boy, which they always go back to the Proud Boys as the ultimate scapegoat. It's a very small group, and the idea, these groups, as I said, their membership have gone down significantly over the years. And so exactly what they're talking about is absurd. ICOP analysts are currently monitoring these social media channels for any potential threats. Again, threat, UFO threat, domestic threat, COVID threat, right? It's always a threat because psychologically they can't get any power unless you're afraid, and you can't be afraid unless you're under a threat. So let's just kind of, undo that knot there and just say they run on threats. So when they're acting in a threat fashion, it means they want you to be afraid, so you give up your power to them. It's a pretty simple equation. ICOP analysts are currently monitoring these social media channels for any potential threats stemming from the scheduled protests and will disseminate intelligence updates as necessary, the bulletin said. The government's monitoring of American social media is the subject of ongoing debate inside and outside of government, particularly in recent months, following a rise in domestic unrest. Well, when the government engages in activities like this, you will get domestic unrest. the interesting thing is, who is pushing the domestic unrest? It's the people who want that civil war activity. That's where, they support all these things, the, cities getting turned on fire. But if you go out and protest against 5G, you're an enemy of the state, watch out. I mean, this is the kind of absurdity it is. And it goes on and on. But making the Postal Service part of this, and by the way, there shouldn't be a debate about the government's monitoring of Americans. It's unconstitutional. That's the end of the debate. Anyone who does it is acting illegally. So very simple. The Postal Service isn't the only part of government expanding its monitoring of social media. In a background call with reporters last month, Department of Homeland Security officials spoke about that department's involvement in monitoring social media for domestic terrorism threats. We know that this threat is fueled mainly by false narratives. Yeah, well, anything that doesn't agree with the official story. And that's why we're kicking off engagement directly with social media companies. DHS is coordinating with civil rights and civil liberties colleagues, as well as our private colleagues, to ensure that everything we're doing is being done responsibly and in line with civil rights and civil liberties. So, Department of Homeland Security, the CIA, they don't believe in civil rights or civil liberties. That's just the junk that they push out there. So on that note, I'm going to read you one last UFO story, and then we're going to tick it out of here. By the way, this, of course, is the movie I was referring to earlier, Total Recall. Really kind of interesting and highly recommended in lieu of all the things we see going on. If you look at it with 30 years hindsight, it's actually quite phenomenal to think of all the different things that they're referring to in there. But the fact that Mars is a very central piece of this is important, and we are going to be doing a story on Elon Musk and his Mars programs. There's a lot of different interesting esoteric keys with Mars also, and I really suggest some videos from Gigi Young, who'll be joining us coming up soon as well. But a lot of her videos dealing with Mars, very, very interesting and very important stuff, so I highly recommend it. The Mars aspect of all the things that are taking place now is fascinating, which is why Total Recall really coming into its own. A couple of things about Total Recall that I thought were interesting. Oh, Quayle's former commanders suddenly speak to him through a telepathic transmitter. This is pretty good for 1966 with Philip K. Dick. Quayle suggests going through another mind wipe, but this time replacing his current awareness of being an assassin with the pleasant memory of an exciting life. His commanders agree, feeling it is their obligation to help their former agent. Quayle turns himself in and is placed with a psychiatrist to figure out what his own personal desires are. When he was young, Quayle used to fantasize that as a child he came across minuscule rodent-like aliens that were going to launch a full invasion of Earth with their superior technology. However, young Quayle was so kind and accepting of the aliens that they decided to hold off on their invasion as long as he was alive. While finding the fantasy narcissistic, his commanders agreed to plant the memories as at recall. To everyone's shock, those memories turn out to be real as well. There's something about Dick's work and how it got turned into Total Recall, but there's something about his work that I think he's one of these guys that's really giving us a message in the future. And, from Do Aliens Dream of Electric Sheep and all the different pieces, I think his work is worth a real heavy review as we go into the 2020s here with all the UAP Task Force stuff, because there's something about how that particular movie was the most expensive movie in its era. Somebody spent a lot of money to get this message out. And of course it grossed incredibly well and was a major success, but it seems like an X-share type activity the more I look back on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We've got a couple minutes left here. I wanted to mention this, which is NBC is now coming out with sympathetic UFO stories like, damn that government holding out on UFO disclosure. I mean, the media participated in that press embargo around UFOs for 70 years also. So the idea of painting themselves as champions of freedom is kind of funny. And of course, you can't talk about COVID or 5G or things like that in the media. They'll only accept one narrative, one agenda now. Everything else is racist, and you get canceled for. So, and when they get to aliens, that'll be the ultimate thing. They'll be like, well, if you accept aliens, then that's racist too. Okay. In the long term, there could be multiple Nobel Prizes, not to mention new laws of physics, for those who are willing to dive in and risk ridicule in the short term. It's a very unusual NBC News article that says, the U.S. military takes UFOs seriously. Why doesn't Silicon Valley or academia? And like I said, we could say, why isn't this article saying, why did the CIA prevent the public from knowing about UFOs for 75 years? It's kind of a better twist. But they mentioned Rubio in here, so we can see that he's a big piece on this. In June, a new task force championed by Senator Marco Rubio must submit an unclassified report on unidentified aerial phenomena to Congress. It comes as several erstwhile officials, including former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, Dirty Harry from Nevada, who oversaw Area 51 for 30 years, and two former CIA directors, John Brennan and James Woolsey, have called for more rigorous looks at these sightings. Oh, those great CIA directors. They're demanding that government free up that information. This, the stuff that they held back for 80 years. The most famous example is the one Musk was asked about, occurred when the Navy pilots reported a craft resembling a Tic Tac, which it doesn't, by the way, look anything like a Tic Tac, that was moving unlike anything seen in the U.S. arsenal. They said it wasn't behaving by the normal laws of physics. The craft's movements were, however, typical of both military and civilian UFO reports. And they go on about how great the Tic Tac video was. And as I've explained on this program, the Tic Tac is a very unusual thing also because we know that part of that video was actually released in 2007 on YouTube, of all places. So there's always been a lot of spin around those videos, and the performance that's going on in those videos is very easily manipulated. So the idea that we have this, crisp footage and it's undeniable and all that, it is unusual footage, but it's very easy to manipulate that stuff. Do you know of any major study where they went in and actually tested the video on that from an independent point of view? The only studies that I've seen about that related to the Tic Tac over and over again were studies that said it could have been easily something else. So there's always been better UFO footage than that stuff. I'm never quite sure, but this is what they were able to use as an entree into this first level of disclosure, and they are bringing things out to that level. My only problem with it really is where they're taking it, as we know. Okay. Former director of intelligence told Fox News last month that there were a lot more sightings than have been made public. Similarly, James Woolsey, he of the Russians killed Kennedy, former director of the CIA, said on a podcast this month he was taking the subject seriously, as did his successor at the CIA, John Brennan, aka the Drone King. The Pentagon hasn't offered an official explanation for UAPs like the Tic Tac craft, calling them unidentified. Former officials don't seem to be willing to utter the word alien, but it's the implication from what they do say. Lou Elizondo, who ran the secret Pentagon UFO tracking unit, has publicly ruled out the theory that the Tic Tac craft came from the U.S. arsenal or from arsenals of our adversaries, leaving only the theory that it came from someone or something else. According to John Brennan, former CIA director, some of the phenomena we're seeing could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. So they've got it pretty lined up here, and it's all around that whole Tic Tac and UAP thing. Now they have the pyramid one, which I would show you. It's sprayed with copyright Jeremy Corbell. The idea that the UAP task force would leak it to Corbell, I think, is interesting too. I mean, why wouldn't they leak it to some other aspect of the government? That's a little bit weird as well. And then George Knapp tried to come out with the Batman balloon thing again, and that was already debunked. So I'm not sure where some of that goes. I mean, are they building a kind of plausible deniability in case that comes apart? It's quite possible. So in any case, I think that what we're looking at with the June 25th release of this report is a major change in how they're going about, on the government side, revealing this type of information. I think that they're preparing to put a narrative piece in there that, yes, there are these aliens out there and we don't know what they're doing, but they could be a threat. So we need a whole new apparatus and infrastructure to deal with them. And they could be preparing all sorts of things along this line. They could be building holograms for it. We have our own reversed engineered technology. So it is a time where we all need to get on board with understanding this on a slightly deeper level and doing that kind of research, because otherwise we're going to be just handed this junk, doctored up junk from the government, and that's not going to get us any closer to actual UFO disclosure. The problem is too many willing accomplices in this around the research field on the UFO file. So, you know, you need a better field, and that's, you know, that takes time to build and all the rest of it. What we can do is we can understand that whatever they're going to roll out is a manipulated narrative that they've already booked out in advance. So, for example, when we see that on June 25th, they've looked at these reports for decades. So for us, it's new, and it's it's spun in a narrative. They'll show us a few more things like that. You know, they'll throw in some more junk, like a Batman balloon, too. But we understand from other people and, you know, a history of UFO contact and pilots and, you know, people who have relatives who've gone through all these different things. So we have it on a human level. We understand it. The CIA op level of the UFO disclosure is false. It's to get us into a place where we can be further manipulated. I remember there was one point during the height of the COVID nonsense where they were coming out with the UFO stuff that they had already released 2 years earlier. It was the same pictures and all the rest. And the Pentagon was confirming it. So it was just the same thing again. But there was a reason why they rolled it out during the pandemic, so they get the widest possible audience of these people trapped at home. And when we think about what they could do, saying, well, you have this health crisis, you need to stay home. And by the way, you change your relationship to everyone else. You can't go to restaurants. You can't talk to people. You can't interact with your children or your grandchildren. You go through all these different dehumanizing things, all in the name of saving your life. Well, just wait till they're able to say there are evil aliens out there and they're coming to get you. Because then, that's the ultimate. That's like Osama bin Laden on steroids, right? You don't need to be some guy in a cave who can direct, this incredible destruction in America by telling some guys with box cutters to get on a plane and fly them into buildings. You can actually be at the mercy of CIA aliens. And don't worry, though, the CIA is going to be there to protect you, because that's where all those missing trillions went. We've been looking out for you, babe. Anyway, everyone, fantastic to be here with you tonight. And I'm sorry we couldn't take your questions. As I said, May 7th, Miss Olivia is returning for part 3 of the X series, and we'll be tuning your questions then. We're going to have a very special interview in between. We just had a very special interview with Bruce Morgan, who is the son of Yvonne DiCarlo, and I highly recommend that very insightful interview and a lot of the things that Bruce had to say. So it was great to have him on the program. We will be back next week with a special interview, and I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Of course, we had Groovy running the ideas room. Thank you. Amazing stuff. Great to see her out there. And we've got Lee Veltman. Fantastic to see you, sir. Wayne Peak, Dark Truth. John R., Thomas Schroeder, Jack, Deborah Blair, it's great to see you. Gypsy Moon, Wayne Peak, Catherine Harris, unbelievable. Ronan Returns, fantastic. Golden Girl, Thank you. And thank you to all the Super Chat people tonight. We really appreciate the support. It's fantastic. And to all our subscribers, it really makes a difference to help us to bring you these kinds of reports that you are so solidly behind us. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. I'll do a couple more of those. Jerome Brown, it's good to see you. Thomas Schroeder, Golden Girl, Hipster. I like that. I know Kate's out there. It's great to have you with us. Wow. Tana Carroll, so many familiar faces out there. Melissa Crimson. Thank you. It's great to see you, everyone. Mount Cleverest, nice to have you here. Niche, it's great to have you out there. Fantastic. Excellent. Someone says, I am Quaid. It's great when he meets Quato, that's for sure. Debbie McAdoo, fantastic. Drumstick 74. Brad Briggs. Excellent people out there tonight. And save all your good questions for the next X Series show, because we're going to be doing a very deep dive in part 3 of X Series 100. Again, you can go to the darkjournalist.com website to sign up for a free newsletter to stay updated on the very, very exciting and explosive shows we have coming up for you in May and June. You're not going to want to miss them, I guarantee you. We will see you back next week with a special interview, and have a great weekend, everyone. We'll be looking for more news on the UAP. I'll be bringing you more of that, and especially what the Biden administration is doing behind the scenes, which I think is being missed a lot on this. Kat Goida, it's great to see you out there. Fantastic. Jay Mallet, Scarlet Fire. Fantastic people tonight in the Ideas Room. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend, as I said. And you know, it says end broadcast, but we know it never really ends. We'll see you all next week. Have a great one, everybody. It's good to see you.